Today we're looking at how to support farmers in the face of climate change, particularly how to manage risk, and to do so in ways that will support agricultural innovation and rural development outcomes. We have 4 pretty exciting presentations for you, which will each be followed by 5 minutes of questions. And at the end of the presentations, we'll have 30 minutes for general discussion. So the overall seminar will be about 1.5 hours. I'm pleased to say that we have 45 people or so online and 40 people in the room, so we have quite an audience. And I just want to cover a few small technical notes before we begin. Everyone's mics have already been muted. For the questions of people online, we kindly ask that you write your questions in the chat box. As well, if you have any technical issues, if you add them to the chat box, we'll try to address them. We have a team here that will address any audio issues or other technical issues you might be having. We do have someone who will then read the questions of the web participants during the question periods. And I should say that the presentations will be available after the seminar on the CCAFS website. And with that, I'd like to begin. Our first speaker is Dr. Bruce Campbell, the director of the CCAFS program.
So I'm wanting to talk about the kind of research that we do, and I'm just going to cover 2 issues: the sort of the scale of the challenge, and therefore the need for a different kind of research, and some of the principles that I see in this new kind of research. So mostly when we talk about the scale of the problem, we have impact data on farmers and things. I want to look at it from a completely different perspective of what we have to actually do to deal with climate change. And so on the left-hand side, we're talking about incremental adaptation. On the right-hand side, transformational adaptation. At the bottom of the graph, it's what farmers have to do. So when there's only small changes in climate, we're talking about shifts to stress-tolerant breeds and varieties. If we're under more extreme conditions, shifts in crops and livestock, and at the right-hand side, where we really have to have transformational change, shifting out of agriculture, understanding migration as a valid adaptation option. As we move up the graph, what do service providers have to do and governments have to do? Local adaptation planning, seasonal advisories, index-based insurance, national food security planning, sovereign insurance for countries in the face of extreme events, early warning systems linked into emergency services. I see agriculture rural AR4D as having to cover all the space. And traditionally, we've been stuck in the bottom left-hand corner, and we have to get out of that bottom left-hand corner. And that was the adaptation part. We have to do that all with lower emissions. So the work that's coming out of our work, out of CCAFS and other partners, is suggesting that agriculture cannot be released from the targets that we need in order to achieve a 2-degree world. So the scale of the problem in terms of changing the farming systems, I think, is really massive. And that makes me believe that the way we do research also has to be totally different from in the past. So Sonia and myself have looked at what we've been doing in phase 1 of CCAFS, and we've come up with these 10 principles for agriculture research for development. If you want to see the original paper, you can just search 10 principles, CCAFS in Google, and you'll probably find it. And I want to just mention 3 of my favorite principles. And the example comes from India, where one of our original programs works, and I think we'll hear about it more later. Working with a major insurance company, and after a very few seasons, reaching 1 million farmers with new insurance products. How does this kind of thing happen? So one of my one of the principles I really like is the 3/3 principle. We have to spend 1/3 of our time working with stakeholders to understand their needs, build trust, get them to understand what research can deliver, what are the research products that they want. 1/3 of the time actually doing the research, and 1/3 of the time, once the research is done, working with the stakeholders to build capacity to use the research products, communication about the research products, and tailoring the research products to different contexts within the places where it could possibly be used. Another one is tackle power and influence. So I'm not promoting our regional program leader to go and foster revolution. What we're thinking about is that you really have to understand that who makes the decisions, when are the decisions made, how can we fit into those processes to make sure research has meaning in society. And the third one, the last one I want to talk about is communicate strategically and actively. And so what I see often in organizations is you have a communication department, and what it mostly does is public relations. And I think that communicators have to be part of impact pathways. So within CCAFS, for example, we have somebody in each flagship, in each region, thinking about communication, understanding the impact pathways, and working towards getting the research out. This may be through mainstream media, such as the BBC, etc., but it will also be creative, new ways of doing business in this information age. And one of the examples is this reality TV show, where we act as a science provider to the TV show. It's reaching 13 million viewers in East Africa. 60% are in rural areas, and 45% of the viewers have made changes in their farming practice as a result of watching the program. So using creative ways of reaching farmers and policymakers. Last slide is not coming up. Oh, okay. So it's not only doing these things, it's also understanding how to do them better. So it's the science of learning about how to achieve outcomes, how to achieve impacts. And this is just one example, a recent paper looking at the theory of change approach. We need more work on actually understanding how we do science better to have outcomes. Thanks. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Bruce. Our next speaker will be Pramod Aggarwal. Our next speaker will be Zougmore, the regional program leader from our West Africa office.
So I will be talking about CCAFS Research for Development experiences on how to get in climate information services to reach farmers, and focusing on progress, but also on gaps. So this is the outline, and I will be mainly basing my case studies on 3 research results in Burkina, in Ghana, and in Senegal. But first of all, it is clear that climate variability and change is a reality, and in Africa, for the last 100 years, there is an unequivocal temperature rise, reaching 0.6 to 0.7 degrees Celsius since the late 70s. And for sub-Saharan Africa, it is important to mention that this temperature rise is even higher than the global level 1. And there is also a sea level rise of about 18 centimeters per year during the last centuries. So these are data from the ICRISAT, which is a technical center working in the Sahel zone of West Africa. And in view of this, one of the most challenges facing agriculture sector is climate change adaptation. And this graph clearly shows that the length of growing season is likely to decline. These are results produced by Phil, Totten, and colleagues using the 4-degree rise temperature scenario and taking 18 climate models to define this length of growing season. And clearly it shows that vast amount of areas in sub-Saharan Africa will be seeing the length of growing season significantly reduced, but by at least 20%. And there is also a huge amount of areas that will see 5 to 20% reduction in this length of growing season. So clearly showing the importance of developing climate change adaptation options for agriculture. And to do that, we need a clear strategy to face climate variability and change, because climate variability occur at different time scale and at different time steps. So we need to use technologies, climate smart technologies, to deal with these options, but this will depend on how we use climate information services as an entry point to target these climate smart agriculture technologies. So depending on the types of management, short management or long-term management, we need to make tactical decisions or to go up to a level of strategic planning. But all of these will require to using climate information services as an entry point to make sure that climate risk is managed considering the local needs, but also some of the opportunities that exist in the different contexts. So these are the 3 cases I will be talking about. So in northern Ghana, we have been working with local partners to make sure that climate services are delivered through mobile phone. And this was done with a private sector IT company. We are also working with some NGOs to ensure that climate services are delivered through the PICSA approach, PICSA being the Participatory Integrated Climate Services for Agriculture. And as of today, about 7,000 farmers are benefiting from all these climate information services. In northern Burkina, we have been also training village farmers from our CSVs, but also using the channel of rural radios to disseminate climate information to the farmers in our climate smart villages. And potentially through the radio system, we can reach 1.2 million farmers in northern Burkina. And in Senegal, CCAFS scientists have been working with the National Met Service to communicate, to design and communicate downscale climate information services through using rural radio programs and mobile phones. And here again, there is an outcome consisting in reaching about 7 million farmers in Senegal. So basically, how are we proceeding? So we are developing along the growing cycle different types of products, of climate information products. So for instance, before the season, the rainy season, we develop seasonal forecasts to allow farmers to decide about the type of crop, the different crop varieties, We provide also the onset forecast for farmers to decide when to prepare the soil, what is the optimal planting date. During the cropping season, they are receiving the nowcasting to avoid, for instance, flooding. They receive the daily forecast to use to decide about how to apply fertilizers, when to do that. They also receive the 10-day forecast to decide about weeding, field work, and so on. And during maturity period, they receive the 10-day forecast to decide about optimal period for harvesting in order to avoid losing all the harvest. So these are the kind of products that we are developing with the different partners and trying to disseminate through different channels to the farmers. So some preliminary results in Ghana shows that the access and use of climate information services influence farmers' decision making. So for instance, 65% farmers are using climate information to decide on what to plant. 86% farmers are deciding when to plant based on climate information services. 64% when to begin land preparation, and 70% when to apply fertilizers. Just an example. And this is based on a sample of about 500 farmers within the climate smart villages. We also try to assess the impact of the use of climate information services on farm productivity. And here again, we see clearly that about 90% of farmers think that using climate information services reduce crop failure. 90% says that it increased crop yield. 78% says that it improves the use of the input use efficiency, so seeds, fertilizers, and so on. And 94% says that the overall productivity is increased thanks to the use of climate information services. In Burkina, we tried to use two value chain crop, cowpea and sesame, and we tried to see how the farm practices are changing in relation to the use of climate forecast. So an example just to show that 56% of farmers decide on the size of their farm depending on the climate information, which is crucial in terms of planning and using the different farm input. Same for the date of land preparation and how to select the crop varieties. So these are crucial steps to avoid the failure of the cropping season and for the yield. And we also try to sample in the climate smart villages, comparing farmers exposed to farmers that are non-exposed to the climate information services. And here we can see clearly that using climate information services allow to have a higher yield compared to those who didn't use it. But of course, this can vary depending on the type of the season. And we also assessed the effect of climate information on the crop revenue. And here we clearly see that farmers exposed to climate information are putting less money to buy the inputs, probably because of the reduction in number of sowing due to, for instance, drought period at the beginning. And this induce an increase in the gross margin of those who are exposed to climate information. And here we also try to assess their willingness to pay for getting climate information. And we see here that farmers are ready, about 50% of farmers are ready to pay to get daily information, decadal information, and even the seasonal forecast information, which is a sign that they are ready to put some money and get the information. So globally speaking, in Senegal, this is the sort of scheme we put in place what we call the multidisciplinary working groups, which are receiving the climate information, transforming them into agro-advisories, and then disseminating this information, especially through mobile phone, but mainly through the rural radio. And in Senegal, we use 83 rural radios. We train them on climate jargon, on how to develop the programs, and with this, we have been able to reach potentially 7.4 million rural people. And climate information is now considered as an agricultural input in Senegal. So, in view of those, there are some few gaps that calls for more research, and these are related to a lack of complete climate databases in countries in order to generate village-level tailored climate information services to cover other subsectors like livestock, fisheries. We need some public-private business models for climate information service dissemination. This is important for the scalability and the sustainability. And we also observe that there is a weak capacity of climate information service stakeholders in terms of MET services not being technically able to develop salient climate information services, the capacity of public and private sector actors to organize sustainable and large-scale dissemination schemes, and the capacity of the users to sometimes understand and use the information we are developing. So these are the issues we need to tackle to bring it further. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So we're going to take about 10 minutes now for questions on these first two presentations. We just had a really nice summary of some of the progress and gaps related to climate information services in a part of the world that can truly benefit from them. So any questions, either from the audience or our online audience? Maria, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Maria Guerrero, and I'm the Adaptation Research Program here for CCAFS. Okay. My name is Maria Guerrero, and I'm the Latin American program leader for CCAFS. So my question is for both for Robert and Bruce, and so we are thinking some way. We are talking about a new way of doing science, or engaging into the generation of knowledge. So, considering your own experience with respect to this, what are the main challenges in this new paradigm in which we are doing science in a different way?
Okay, I have a start. I think one of the issues is really the, and it's beyond our control. It's the training system of scientists and the incentive systems for the scientists once they're in organizations. So if you meet young students at universities, often they're really interested to engage their science in society. They're really interested in interdisciplinarity, engaging with society, etc., etc. But actually, most of those ones leave science, I think, because they think, it's not for me, because then they start doing a PhD and they have to become so reductionist. So I think there's a real problem in the whole training stuff. And then, in the assessment of performance of scientists in organizations, it's still very much conventional classical stuff, which is based on the number of citations of your papers in fancy journals. And I think that's changing a bit. I've heard the university in Australia where I used to work is now, they're including a whole section on connection with society. So, because it's the universities that often don't change very fast. CGIAR is perhaps a little bit better. There's a little bit of recognition that outcomes are important.
Okay, do you want?
Yes, to add to what Bruce said, in the ground, one of the key challenges is that, for instance, CCAF has been investing a lot of effort to capacitate our local partners to conduct the research through training on different tools and so on and so forth. However, we sometimes observe that there is a sort of non-stability of these partners within the institutions. And so it seems like we need to constantly capacitate and train the different partners, which is not really effective, and it is time consuming. So sort of weak capacity of our partners to really take on in a sustainable manner all the capacity building things we are doing.
We'll take other questions. Leo?
Yeah, I'm Leo Sebastian from CCAFS South Asia. Robert, you clearly described that we have a problem of a weak capacity of partners, and in many places the extension is actually collapsing. And now you have this climate information service, which will require a more complex sending of messages and interaction of several entities within a country to come up with all this package of information to be disseminated. So in your from your analysis, who would be the best group to do the upscaling and outscaling of this kind of services in countries like Burkina or Ghana, in the countries where you are working?
This is an important question, and from the case I presented in Ghana, we have been trying to work with a private sector IT platform to already design the climate information services. Of course, they will be working with the National Met Service to get the data, to get the knowledge, and so on. But for the dissemination, again, we have been working with NGOs to make sure that they are the ones who really work closely with farmers. So I believe that it would be a sort of public-private partnership types of schemes that we should be promoting to make sure that it can be sustainable.
We do have 2 questions from our online audience.
So the first question is for Robert from Edmund Thousand at ICRISAT. So Edmund's question is that climate change is only one of the many various barriers that smallholder farmers are exposed to. How do you embed climate information services in a wider institutional context to also deal with market challenges and access to inputs? Because the increase of yield through access or exposure to climate information services may not make an impact unless you have access to a regulated market.
Yeah, I think this is linked to the questions of Leo about how to make sure that we have some effective dissemination channels for climate information services. And I think that at the institutional level, we really need to capacitate all the different stakeholders involved. And when I say capacity building, it goes from how, for instance, the IT platform can benefit from reliable databases. Because sometimes we see private companies using data that are not actually certified reliable. So working with the National Met Services and others may help them to benefit from reliable data. So on the dissemination side, I think we need to capacitate all these mobile phone companies or IT platforms that are trying to do business out of this product. And definitely at the ground level, working with, let's say, civil society organization working closely with farmers seems to be the best option to sustain the process.
And we have time for one more question, and we'll go back to our online audience.
So Robert, it's actually a follow-up question to what you just said. It relates to business models and private sector and the need for their role in scaling up. So what has been the experience in Senegal where you achieved such a large outcome? How do you engage with the private sector and what business models were scaled up?
So in the case of Senegal, as I mentioned, we train the Rural Radio Association, which can be considered as a private sector institution. And currently in the ground, we are working with farmers groups that are organized around certain value chain crops. And we believe that this is also an opportunity to develop some sort of business model, climate information dissemination. But these are still preliminary stages in view of the nature of the subsistent farming nature of Senegal, for instance.
Perhaps I could just quickly add is that, that we shouldn't divorce the climate agenda from all the other agendas. So market prices, general development trends, we have to engage with that. So we shouldn't just become a climate program and forget about all the rest.
We do have one more quick question from the online audience, and I think we have time for a brief answer.
So this is again to Robert. So you showed that for some farming decisions, many farmers use climate information services. That was 56%, and for other decisions, only 4%. What causes this difference?
So far, I think it is linked to the quality of the climate information also, because we should agree that it is not that much tailored to the real need of some of the context. So this can explain why, for instance, we had such low percentage of farmers using certain types of climate information. And this called for research to improve the kind of specific needs, including the different sectors, because we have been focusing on crop production, but we see a big demand coming for livestock, fisheries, and other sectors, subsectors.
Thank you. Great questions. May I remind the online audience to please include your name and affiliation so we know who's posing the question. We'll proceed now with Dr. Pramod Aggarwal, the Regional Program Leader for our office in South Asia.
Thank you very much, Lenny. So what I'm going to talk about is crop insurance, again trying to illustrate how different types of partnership, how different way of doing science can possibly help us in scaling up our research ideas. So this is in context of insurance that I shall be talking about. All right, so if we quickly look at some of the statistics, last 20 years, roughly more than 2 billion people are affected by floods. More than 1 billion people have been affected by droughts. Close to 94 million people are affected by extremes of temperature, and similarly if you see storms and other climatic risks. Overall, there's a big number of people that are getting affected by climate-related disaster. And interestingly, as you see from this graph, incidence of such disasters is increasing with time. Whether we call them meteorological, hydrological, or climatological, all of them seem to be showing a consistent increase with time, and that's a reason for concern. And where are these disasters happening? So again, this is a summary of last 20 years. So you see the darker the color, more are the disasters there. So again, you see here, Asia is a major region where you see huge number of disasters. The footnote says more than 150 to 472 disasters, cumulative disasters in this region. Similarly, in other parts of America and elsewhere. So big number, large number of disasters affecting some of these densely populated areas, and that's why a lot of interest in insurance. So you see here, what is the current insurance business? Of course, the largest is in North America, but followed by that is Asia. It's increasing continuously. India and China, two of the most populous regions, are seeing big growth in insurance because of some of the climatic risks that I just mentioned. Let me move on from there to give you a more detailed example about India, with which I'm a little bit more familiar, that how insurance sector has been changing over time. So India is one of the largest insurance program We have two types of schemes here, yield index and weather index. This is already there for almost 30 years. This is linked to subsidy. And if you look at the number of farmers today, it has increased to almost 30 million farmers are insured today. It's a big achievement. 40 million hectares are insured today. And almost 1/3 of them are covered by weather-based insurance. But what is also important for us to realize, despite such big numbers, 80% farmers still remain uninsured. So that's a big worry, and government is trying its best to see how best this number can increase. Interestingly, although we talk about such big numbers, yet all stakeholders involved remain dissatisfied. What is the key reasons? If you look at from perspective of farmers, they're very worried about how the scheme is governed, institutions, and also about literacy. More specific, farmers dealing with weather-based, they're still concerned about weather variability, density of weather station, design of products, and so on and so forth. Farmers dealing with index-based, yield index-based insurance are also not happy because they don't feel their basic risk is getting covered. But also other stakeholders are also remaining dissatisfied. Industry is very unhappy. They see it's a lot of transaction costs because of frequent government interventions, very smallholder farmers in India, that too very scattered, so overall large transaction costs. Government also remains worried because despite all this, agrarian distress seems to be still increasing and huge subsidy outflow. So this is a very peculiar situation, although we talk about so many farmers, yet everybody somehow to different degrees remain dissatisfied. So when we were trying to address this problem, so we have come up with a new methodology to find improved triggers for weather insurance, a product that should be win-win not only for farmers, but if you only address farmers' concern, if it's not addressing industry's concern, the government's concern, it is not successful. So we're trying to find product that is win-win situation for farmers, industry, and governments. Ideally, it should pay. This type of scheme should pay when amount compensation is due and in right amount. What industry wants, the claim ratio, that is claim to premium ratio, should be about 70 to 80% so that it remains viable for them to remain in this business. And government, of course, doesn't want subsidy load to keep increasing. So what we did is a slightly different methodology, a little slightly complex. I will not go into full details of this, but we use historical crop weather data. Traditionally, that's available for many regions in India. We use multiple models, statistical models, crop growth models to find out what sort of triggers and what sort of biological range of those triggers are available. But what we did then we tried to optimize them for all the three objectives, that what sort of triggers will give us results that will take care of interest of farmers, that is increase farmer satisfaction, help industry to maintain that business, and also not increase premium subsidies. So we went through several rounds of iteration in consultation with industry and government to come up with a product. So this is one example of cotton from state of Maharashtra, where climatic risks are very high. So if you just look at the left-hand side, existing contract, the blue bars are satisfaction index on a scale of 1 to 10. And the yellow bars are claim ratio, that how many times, so what is exactly the ratio of premium to claims. And claim frequency, the middle bar is the claim frequency, that how many times claims have to be paid. So if you look at existing contracts on a scale of 1 to 10, current schemes, the satisfaction of farmers is only close to 2, 2.5. So practically no wonder farmers are dissatisfied. And if you look at claim ratio, it's more than 1. So obviously it is not an incentive for farmers, for industry to keep investing in insurance sector, because that seems to be a loss-making proposition. So why should anybody really be happy? I think that's almost clear from here, and claims have to be paid almost every year. So it's working more as a social welfare scheme rather than as an insurance scheme at this stage. So using the methodology which I explained a little while ago, if you look at the central 3 bars, we are able to change the satisfaction from 2.5 to close to 6. We are still not able to do perfectly because our understanding of science and also availability of data still is not perfect. But nevertheless, we're able to improve satisfaction from 2.5 to 6, reduce claim frequency from practically every year to almost, let's say, 2-3 years, and claim ratio also comes down close to 1. But this is a situation where farmers are satisfied, but industry is still not satisfied. Because claim ratio is 1, that means there is no investment for industry to invest in insurance sector. So we further optimized this, and finally we came up with this proposed contract where we hardly sacrifice farmer satisfaction, but we came up with triggers, which are still biologically relevant triggers, but that help industry also to remain viable, farmer satisfied, without increasing premium subsidy in the government. And if you look at this results for 4 different crops in Maharashtra, this is the level of satisfaction with the schemes that were operational at that time. Again, you can see satisfaction index almost from nothing to maximum 4, depending on crop. And with this new proposal, we're definitely able to improve the satisfaction, improve the business atmosphere. Of course, as I said, it is still not a perfect solution, and we are still struggling to find that perfect solution. But as a consequence of this, what we see here, that the scheme is already adopted by Maharashtra government. More than 1 million farmers are using this in 1 season alone. The key thing is that we change our research style. So we started working more on demand-driven products, and continuous engagement in industry and government in model development and evaluation really helped us. But having said that, now we have a new scheme announced by Government of India. The target is to go from 30 million to 60 million farmers in next 3 years. It's a very ambitious target, but it's a very attractive scheme, big boon for farmers. Premium subsidies extremely increased. Farmers only have to pay 1.5% to 2%, so that's already stimulating big interest of farmers. It's an area-based scheme, and it also encourages public-private partnership a lot. So there's a new challenge that one has to address, that how to make this scheme operational. So these are the key research gaps that we have to address. Yield index, loss assessment methodology, how do we do sampling, where do we do sampling, and level playing field for industry. Because since this has become public-private partnership, we really need to identify, since we're talking of such a large country. And of course, importance of weather-based index design has really come down, because this is only weather, whereas what the policy provides is no all-round compensation for our risk. But so what is really needed is a double trigger product now. So we are trying to do a number of different types of research activities, using satellite data, using UAVs, using handheld sensors, and also digital cameras to understand how do we capture some of this variability in field. As we speak, some of these UAVs are flying in our field to record this data. And you will see here some of the remote sensing work, but we will not have time to get into details of this. So before I conclude, I would just quickly like to point out an area on which we repeatedly keep discussing. Is insurance really helping agriculture development? So this is not work that we did ourselves, but this is work done in India again by someone else. What you see here, whenever insurance payments are made, the jury is still out. It's not necessarily that farmers are investing it back in agriculture development. So you see here in terms of input use, fertilizer, seed, pesticide, or even taking more credit, where not everyone is really going for that. Almost 50% farmers use it, 50% farmers use it for some other purpose, which is also important. The overall food security, livelihood security is also important, but not necessarily everything is really being channelized again in agriculture development. 1 or 2 more slides. Quickly, if I just go around. Yes, another key reason that we also have to understand, very related to some of the questions that we just had to Robert, we are talking more from technology angle. But if you look at why farmers are dissatisfied, technology is just one dimension. They're interested in many other dimensions, more about the institutional aspect, that why insurance benefits are not coming to them in time, why don't they have the sum that they have insured, and nobody's there to explain what exactly is insurance about. So I think if we want schemes to be successful, and if we really want to scale up, we also need to simultaneously address many of these issues. My final slide, what are the next steps for us to scale out? I think there are several options and several challenges, and we are all trying to do that. We're trying to come up with very high resolution schemes. Every farmer feels that his basis should be covered. He doesn't care about what happens to neighbors. So schemes which are farmer specific, using remote sensing, vegetation indices, satellite weather, crop models, and also involving farmers directly in some of this by using crowdsourced information, and engaging farming communities as and when possible in monitoring, reporting, and verification. That's again quite important for us to increase satisfaction of farmers. And there are a couple of more bullets. Hopefully they should come up. All right, it seems my time is up. All right, so a couple of more points. Building with disaster relief, because there are two different ways. To some extent, climate risk is also partly related to disaster relief, which is a separate scheme, but how do we bundle them together so that the benefits of two schemes go to farmers together? And of course, bundling with other risk management initiatives so that there's a whole all-around agriculture development, bundling insurance with drought-tolerant varieties, water management, something that we are trying in our climate-smart villages all over the world today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pramod. Okay, we have time for just a couple of questions from either our present audience or our online audience. Meryl, and please introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Meryl Richards with the CCAFS flagship on low emissions agriculture. Pramod, I was just wondering, going back to Bruce's model of 3/3 research in this presentation, what kind of capacity building do you have to do with partners to roll out this insurance?
Well, I would say here the capacity building was in fact both ways. It was not only capacity building of our partners, it was also capacity building of researchers. I think we learned a lot from industry and government that how research should be done. Otherwise, we were very focused in our research. They brought a sea change in our approach to research. So capacity building, that how do we really take care of farmers' interests, industry's interests, and government's interests. I think that was a big change in our own style of working. But of course, they also in the process gained to understand that how research is being done and how they can really use some of our research to their advantage. So I would say capacity building is on both sides.
Other questions?
Bruce? It's Bruce Campbell. What double trigger insurance products? Can you briefly explain it?
So, yeah, it's like, sorry for using all this insurance jargons here. A double trigger product basically means during a 3-season period, so yield estimation comes normally after you have harvested. But by that time, if farmer has lost his crop or has lost partial crop, then he needs to be compensated. So he cannot wait till that time. So double trigger product means a trigger like weather, sometime in mid-season, to give him some compensation so that his life can go on.
Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit now. We've just talked about two different approaches to dealing with climate that involve fairly large programs, insurance and climate information services. Now we're going to switch to scaling up in ways that address a variety of different technologies, but also focus on the social equity aspect. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Sophia Huyer, the Gender and Social Inclusion Lead at CCAFS.
Okay, I will be looking at gender differences in how farmers take up and adopt climate-smart agriculture. And in this presentation, I will report on gender results of CCAFS work in 3 main areas around adopting CSA technologies and practices, benefits from CSA training, and access to and use of climate information. Okay. Sorry, I'm distracted here. CCAFS research has found that there are gender differences in adaptation strategies and practices by women and men. So research a few years ago in Rakai, Uganda, looked at, on the left-hand side, we have women's responses and the common changes that women make in response to climate change, and on the right-hand side, the most common responses and changes made by men. And while in not all communities you have this great difference in responses. You can see that while women's first response would be to increase the land in production, the men's inclination was to start planting trees on farms. For women, the second choice was then to plant trees, and the third to set up food storage, while for men, the second option was to change crop type and increase land in production. So what we're finding that while women and men in many situations understand and have similar perceptions around climate change and what may be happening, they have different preferences and priorities in what they need to respond to and adapt to climate change. And these differences come in the different types of crops that women and men are responsible and the different kinds of agricultural production practices. They also depend on differences in access to and control over resources by women and men in a household, and also between male-headed households and female-headed households, and participation in decision-making, all of which are based by sociocultural norms that may differ, may be the same across regions, and may be the same and may differ over time. So there are complicating factors that will affect how CSA is taken up. Another example in East Africa was in regards to preferences around bean crops. So while men were interested in market value and yield, women were looking for other benefits in the bean crops, such as shorter cooking times, good taste, and nutrition value. Is this right? Sorry. So as a result, women and men have different preferences in the CSA practices they will take up. This research in 4 communities in Eastern Africa shows that there are a wide range of differences between women and men in the types of practices they prefer, the types of practices they find most useful. In some cases, there will be equal attitudes or equal preferences, but in other cases, there will be quite a marked difference in usage or in preference. So, for example, composting in Yando, Kenya. If you look at that example, you see that women, 63% of women would adopt this practice, while only 24% of men would. But other practices are much more closer to equal. And so if you look at no or minimum tillage as a response, in calf breeding, it's quite close, 58 and 50%. Looking at the example of 3 specific technologies, laser land leveling, microdosing, and rice drum feeders, they found in Northwest India that while laser land leveling is not necessarily a technology that only large farms can take up, sociocultural barriers in the community prevented women from taking advantage, or women farmers from taking advantage of this technology as much as men. And so, in fact, women found it much more difficult to approach the service providers, and if they did want to use the technology, they sent their sons or their husbands or a male member of their household to approach the service provider and make the deal. So this kind of thing is an example of how existing social gender norms may inhibit women from taking up CSA technologies. In the second example of microdosing and fertilizers, some research in Zimbabwe found that training increases the probability of using these technologies, fertilizers and microdosing, but that female-headed households were less likely to take up the microdosing practice, and that was probably because they did not have access to the information on how it was used and the benefits. And that relates to differing levels of access to information, and particularly extension for women and men. And finally, the case of rice drum seeders here in Maharashtra shows different preferences. So while women and men may have roughly equal access to these technologies, they have different reasons for wanting to use the technology. And so for men were interested in the potential for increasing yields, increasing income, and reducing costs, because men were handling the cash. They were responsible for the cash flow in the household, while women, who contributed a large share of the labor for transplanting rice or provided the labor work, which is unpaid on farms, were much more interested in the fact that it was a labor nice example in South Africa of a women-targeted training course on rice farming, where women were given training and information on pest management. I'm back up. Women were given information on pest management, fertilizer and pesticide use, other production information and practices such as different varieties and so forth. And it was very successful training in terms of women's confidence in themselves, women's increase in information, and in effect, their social position in the family. So what happened was that they began to participate more in household decision making on varietal choice, crop management, and post-harvest management. So they participated in the decisions around the production, but they also participated more on spending decisions within the household, including for children's education. And this was partly because of increased knowledge, but also because once they applied these techniques to their own production, they increased their production and their income and were able to expand their range of production to improve nutrition in the household as well. So this table shows how women felt as a result of this training, that their social position had increased. 75% of the women felt that their position in the family had increased, that the members of their family had greater respect for the woman and her knowledge and her ability to contribute to household decision making. The women had more confidence discussing agriculture and also household issues with family members. And they also contributed more to decisions and discussions around children's education. Okay, so around access to and use of climate information, I'll talk about two examples here. On the left is the example I will talk about around access to voice, mobile phone-based farming information for women and men. And so what this study found was that in India, gaining information through phones, voice information services, can reduce the information asymmetry between women and men farmers. Even though women may not necessarily have contributed to the same farming practices as their husbands, they would listen to information about those farming practices so that they could feel more confident in making decisions. Additionally, 83% of women in one part of the region of that province used the information that they gained through this voice information service, and 70% women overall felt that they gained more information on CSA technologies and practices. Another successful information service or information communication strategy is the Shamba Shake-Up that Bruce has been talking about before. An evaluation about 2 or 3 years ago found that over 400,000 households in Kenya had made changes in their farming practices as a result of the television show, and there were some interesting gender effects as well. So that while both male and female maize farmers benefited from the changes they made on their farms, men benefited slightly more. But the real value for women was in the dairy farming segments, or in the changes they could make in their dairy farming. Their output increased by 59%. While men's output also increased, it wasn't to the greatest, as much of an extent. And overall, in terms of the entire range of farming practices, women benefited slightly more than men. So these are two examples of how information can really reach women as well as men in a really productive way. However, we also know from research in different regions, West Africa and South Asia, among other places, that women do often need different channels and types of information. So I'll leave this slide for you, just showing that, in fact, when you can reach women with information, they can sometimes be more likely to use the information than men. but that you also need to be aware that there are going to be gender differences in access to the information and the ways that women are more comfortable or more able to access information. So, for example, public meetings, public information boards, radio, TV may be a more successful practice than more high technology-based solutions or extension. And so I won't go into detail on this, but this is from a recent study in Ghana, which shows some of the differences women and men had in accessing mobile phone, mobile-based information services. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that women do take up practices, they do access information for both climate information as well as agricultural production, but that they often need to be involved and targeted, especially so that their situation, their priorities, their access to resources, and their status in the community is taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, for a really nice breakdown of how the gender dimension fits with some of the themes that were addressed earlier. So we have a few minutes now for questions specifically on Sophia's presentation, and then we'll move into a general discussion. And again, the online audience, please feel free to put your questions in at any time. I would like to ask that we make it a lively conversation, and everybody feel free to chip in. So, Maren, please.
Yeah, my name is Maren Radeni from CCAFS West Africa. Sophia, you mentioned about the different preferences by men and women in terms of the I'm just wondering, apart from the gender preferences, what could be some of the underlying factors that explain the differences in preferences?
Okay. Should I reply immediately, or shall we wait?
Do we need to repeat the question? What are the question is, what are the underlying?
Yes, do you want me to reply now, or shall I wait for other questions? Okay. I think I mentioned that there was one example I gave in the presentation about women had different preferences, for example, for beans, because they were cooking for the family. Sorry, women have different preferences for bean crops because they were cooking for the family, while men were more interested in the market value or in the price that they could get for the crops. So in some respect, it relates to women's role in the household, but it also relates to women's, the prioritization sometimes of women's activities and men's activities. So for example, I didn't get a chance to use this example, but in terms of information on weather and seasonal information, women were less interested in the onset of rainfall information and more interested in the status of rainfall a month or two into the season. So they're more interested in drought information and how long the rains would last, because men's crops and men's land were addressed first by the family, and women's land was taken care of afterwards. So there are these different kinds of there are these differences that relate to just situation, access to resources, role in the household, and how women are trying to fulfill the responsibilities they have in relation to the larger household issue.
Thank you, Sophia. That's an interesting presentation on some interesting case studies about gender. My question is, are we getting to the stage where we have enough information from a range of different case studies to actually be able to say something, to come up with more general information that can help with targeting, for example?
I think we are, actually. I think that it does still need to be supplemented probably by some regional research, and we don't yet know, for example, the gender uptake around things like insurance. But I think that even though there are, we're not going to get down to the level of which crops do women prefer and which crops do men prefer, because it does change, and it's variable from region to region. But I think that we can understand, A, the types of questions that need to be asked to ensure that both women and men are going to benefit in a particular situation. And I think we can probably start to make some generalizations about the purpose of agricultural production and differences in that for women and men. the difficult part is that, you know, things are changing constantly. And so we're coming up against this. Climate change is changing the situation, obviously, but also things like migration to rural urban centers, because men and young men, and to a certain extent young women, are migrating to the cities, leaving women in charge of the farms. So in a sense, we're in some areas, we're getting to the point where the gender difference is more that women are taking more of a role in a larger range, a much wider range of responsibilities. And so that we need to actually understand how to work with women rather than, and to understand that there may be some barriers in how we work with them so that they can benefit. But in terms of the, you know, the conclusions you can make about these things, you know, make a lot.
So yeah, this is Ana Maria from CCAFS Latin America. So continuing on Phil's question, thinking about research for development in agriculture and the gender agenda, what are the main things that we need to do now? What are the gaps? What are the main tasks that we should involve? What are the main questions that we need to answer now at this point?
For gender?
Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the questions we need to address is how do you reach women? How do you reach women in a way that's empowering to them? And we're still grappling with that. I think we're coming up with solutions. But for example, if we're providing information to women, what kind of information do they want? What kind of information is really going to empower them? And how do we ensure that this is not just information that would otherwise go to men and they are also getting it, whether it really helps them the same way or not. So we need to come to that understanding of how to do it. So it's in a way a methodology, but it's also understanding the strategies and the approaches that are best suited to reach women and all groups in society. The other question I think we still have to, there are two more questions I would say we still need to grapple with. One is household decision-making, intra-household decision-making. How do you understand that and work with that in a way that there's that all members of a household will have a voice in decisions that are made around agricultural production and other issues. And you know, there's the balance to be struck between being too interventionist and coming in and telling people what they should be doing, but also helping, and on the other hand, perhaps setting up a situation, discussing the CSA practices and technologies, bringing in the information in a way that generates a more equal decision-making in the household. And we've seen some of that around in India around the voice call, the voice information. And we've also seen some of that in other regions in Latin America where they're trying different strategies to engage the household in decisions around this. So that's the second thing. The third one I think would be that we haven't really explored yet in CCAFS too much is the role of women's organizations. I think that can be a strategy or a method for empowering women in a way that's not, that works with the existing community structures and existing sociocultural norms and can give women a platform and kind of a basis support to express their needs and to increase their influence on the workplace.
So now we have 20 minutes for our general discussion. We can come back to any questions that you might have on any specific presentation. And I'd also like to return to the slide that Bruce opened with, which is the huge, immense task of working both with the uncertainty of the transformational nature of adaptation that we'll need, but also at these multiple scales. And I think each of these presentations addressed really well the nature of the different kind of research that's going to be needed, that it's going to be very much demand-driven, that it's involving novel kinds of partnerships, and that we have successes and failures that require a learning kind of approach. So I'd like to open the floor now to think about what is the vision for the kinds of approaches that we're going to need, where are we making progress, where are the gaps, and any specific questions on these presentations. So if you had a question.
Yes, this is Robert from CCAFS West Africa. On the gender research issues, I think, at least concerning sub-Saharan Africa, we sometimes don't investigate enough the issue of social barriers to the involvement of women, youth in the different initiatives. And I think this is an area of research that needs also to be considered as a priority.
Does anyone want to comment on that from the speakers? Marilyn Linda.
This is Meryl Richards from the CCAFS Low Emissions Agriculture flagship. The question or thought that I sort of had, ruminating in my mind since Bruce brought up that slide, that I don't know if other people have thought about this too, is sort of, in a world where, we are looking at transformation of agricultural systems with climate change and the kind of transformational adaptation changes that we'll need that might involve shifting out of agriculture and issues like migration. What's the role, we're an agricultural research and development organization. What do people see sort of as the role of an agricultural research organization in addressing those, and sort of how far beyond, our current areas of expertise do we need to push ourselves to address those sort of transformational changes?
Philip Thornton, CCAFS. I think that's a very good question, and I think part of my response would be that we have a role in trying to help identify the thresholds beyond which transformations, including sort of movement of people out of agriculture, seems to be increasingly necessary. And so I think we can, it's not, I think, that we have to necessarily engage directly with sort of multi-sectoral work, although we may do in some situations. But if we can help to identify where are those sort of tipping points in agricultural systems in rural areas beyond which we know things are going to be bad or things are getting worse in the future, beyond which then governments and local organisations will then can then help rural people to transform their lives, which is basically what would be required.
What about the question of food security, though? You're answering Meryl's question at the level of households shifting out of agriculture, but isn't there still a role for agricultural organizations in understanding how we're going to meet food security needs when that shift out of agriculture happens? What did you
Yeah, I'd like to address this. You see, I think the point that Phil raised and what Meryl raised are all very relevant. In a way, see, the migration out of agriculture is already happening in many developing societies. It's not that that has to happen only in future as a result of this transformational changes. The tipping point, in fact, for a variety of reasons is already there. Climatic risks, the way they are increasing, will further accelerate. Some of these tipping points will be further becoming closer. And that also relates to our debate about youth in agriculture and gender in agriculture and so many other aspects that we often talk about. The related question that you're trying to raise is about food security. If farmers start migrating out of farming, what happens to food security? I think the key issue here is that we really need to increase the efficiency and productivity. Right now, in many developing societies, including from our own country in India, what we see, there's a lot of inefficiency the way agriculture is practiced. So I think that's the key, that we really need to strengthen, to improve our food security without always asking farmers to stay in farming.
Bruce?
So perhaps this is a bit controversial, but if you're a maize research institute, the solutions are generally maize. If you're a rice research institute, the solutions are somewhere around rice. And I think we have, as a climate change program, we should be able to push the transformational agenda to say, no, yeah, we really need a change in farming system from maize to something, or rice to maize, or something to livestock, etc., etc. But then I can also say, as an agricultural institute, the solutions are agriculture. Or as a climate change program, the solutions are all related to climate change. And I think we have to be broader than that, and really where we see that we have to shift out of agriculture in region X in the next decades, we have to start pushing that agenda. Even if it means that our livelihoods as agricultural researchers in that particular location are not important anymore, and we must shift agriculture to improving productivity in other places in the region. So I think as a climate change program, we've got quite an interesting role to be able to really shift agendas. So it's something, some of our work should be about big thinking, about migration, shifting farming systems, etc., etc.
Great, thank you.
I'm Bulgarian from CCAFS South Asia. My question is related to the early warning systems as detected in the presentation. So we see that early warning system will be developed at the national level. It's a top level to this million farmer. But it doesn't mean that million farmer who receives that information can use the information. So that's also related to the part that quality of information. At the local level, in science-specific condition, it's a big issue. That's why that zero early warning information is not really relevant to local condition. So my question is that, is it that you have a strategy or plan to improve the early warning information and link it with the corrective action at the local level? I also want to take this chance to learn the parents from Africa, Latin America, and South Asia.
So I think it's a good question because often we talk about seasonal forecasting, but I think there's like a continuum between seasonal forecasting and the sort of disaster relief forecasting. And we should be all, just like the transformational stuff, I think we should be along that entire continuum. But perhaps Jim is the one to answer this question.
Okay, a couple of comments. Jim Hansen, Flagship 4 leader, Climate Services and Safety Nets. A couple of thoughts on that. As we're getting into climate information services and seeing what more and more actors are, there's a lot of overlap between the kinds of well-developed information systems that already exist to serve humanitarian organizations and what's needed for local decision-making. Because of variability, because of risk, we will always need the early warning and humanitarian response systems at a large scale. But for many smaller scale risks, if decisions are made more locally, they can often be made earlier to prevent as opposed to responding to disasters. And so blurring the boundaries between food security early warning systems and rural climate services, I think, is a useful strategy. For example, in Rwanda, we're attempting to provide common platforms that serve both audiences, both purposes. There are also some technologies that are becoming available to provide more locally relevant climate information. In the past, the scarcity of long-term weather stations has been a major barrier, but advances in combining station observations that have high quality with satellite and other proxy data that have a complete spatial and temporal coverage at a pretty high resolution allows us to create very locally relevant information at a scale that's relevant to farming communities, but also inform that can be used for governments and for humanitarian organizations as well. Unfortunately, with tight budgets, the early warning aspects for humanitarian responses has been something that has suffered from a tightening budget. So this is an area that we would like to go into that we think can add a lot of value, and it's just not as strong as we think the opportunity is before us because of the resources.
Would anybody like to comment on the regional differences? You know, we've only heard from a couple of regions. Is the experience with the crop insurance or climate information services very different in different places? Ana Maria.
Yes, this is Ana Maria from Latin America.
So I think that what we are doing now is trying to exploit the similarities, the differences, and trying to learn from other regions' experiences. And that's what's basically happening this year with the climate information services work in Latin America. So we are taking PICSAT, which has been used widely in Africa, and they have a lot of lessons learned, and we are implementing the methodology in Latin America. And it has been really exciting seeing all the people that have been working on this in Africa being so happy and excited of telling us all the lessons learned from that experience, and then obviously adjusting that to the Latin America context. So I think that that's been really, really interesting. And regarding the early warning systems, not strictly for humanitarian responses, but in general, thinking about climate information, we have a really nice experience in Colombia of how this has been done in a participatory way, including the traditional knowledge from the indigenous people in our region in Colombia. So they have been following for years in the past these signals from specific animals, so they know that it's going to rain tomorrow or not. And what we have been doing is trying to validate the forecast, the scientific forecast, with these signals that indigenous people have been using in the past, and then trying to put them together and have a stronger package in terms of early warning systems. So that's something that is also very exciting.
Yeah, this is Mary from CCAFS West Africa. Well, it's more of a question to Robert based on his presentation. So you have these very nice examples from few countries in West Africa. And just wondering, what are some of the mechanisms for scaling out some of these good practices to other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa? And also linking with the insurance in India. How can we foster learning, knowledge sharing across different regions and also continents?
So these studies are conducted in the framework of our research pilot to provide evidence of what is working under which condition, including the aspect of scaling up criteria. So we believe that if we have sufficient evidence of the effectiveness of all these work, as we started to show it, plus the lessons learned from the whole process, I think we can easily convince some of the donors of the government public sector institutions that are leading all these agricultural sector things. So this is the current impact pathway towards the scaling up of this.
This is Arun Casey. I'm from CCAFS South Asia. So I just want to ask adaptation, incremental and transformational adaptation. Can we consider these institutional changes in CSVs for the implementation of climate smart villages? There are a lot of institutional arrangements and institutional changes that could be transformational adaptations or not. That's my question.
Well, did you want to respond?
Not to this, but
I can respond. I don't think it's transformational. I kind of think it's more in the incremental stage. It's not, because the transformational adaptation is really shifting systems, big changes.
I wanted to respond to the larger issue that we were discussing earlier about South-South cooperation and learning from each other. So, you see, the key thing which I see in developing world, the key constant is capital. That's number one thing that every time is a major constraint. Whether we talk of early warning system, insurance, or agriculture technologies, it's not only individual on-farm costs, but you also have to think in terms of institutional costs. So let me take just an example of insurance. So insurance globally is highly subsidized. Somebody has to provide that subsidy. Even if we come up with technologies and products, unless somebody is subsidizing, the uptake of some of these products is very low. And since government, as I said, have limited capital, they will have to prioritize whether they want to invest in what we are discussing here, or maybe there are better priorities like water management, good seeds, fertilizers. So I think there's a mechanism every country has to prioritize.
And I also just want to remind the people who are still online, we do have only 5 minutes left, so this is your last chance to ask questions. So,
yes, I wanted to just add to what Bruce said, that in the current CSVs, it is more of tactical decision making. For instance, in Catherine, we see farmers deciding to protect the baobab tree to benefit greatly from the fruits that will be produced. But at the same time, they started to have a vision for a sort of transformational adaptation in the sense of protecting the forest zones so that in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, the next generation will not suffer the same issues that they are facing.
My name is Mary, and this is a question to Bruce. You did mention that, particularly for the sub-Saharan Africa, we need to transform agriculture from just incremental changes to transformational changes. So my question is this: in sub-Saharan Africa, we are affected by social-cultural practices, not climate change is affecting that. Non-tenuous systems, religion, from traditional religions to Christianity to Islam, all these factors are playing within that continent. So how can we move from incremental to transformational agriculture now?
So I predict that in a decade, Africa is going to totally transform. So if you look at the GDP of African countries at the moment, it's going like this. If you look at cell phone coverage in rural areas, it's going like this. In a decade, I would say everybody in the rural areas has got access to smartphone. And I think that is just going to drive mega changes. So I actually don't, I almost don't think we're going to have to stimulate transformational change because it's going to happen. So, perhaps not a decade, perhaps 2 decades, but I think there's going to be massive changes.
So just as a round of now, a way to conclude this really interesting hour and a half, I want to ask people to think about, as we try to achieve this transformational level of change, we're all having to go out of our comfort zones as either scientists generally, but also as agricultural scientists and as people working for an agricultural research program. What are the gaps, the things that need to change? Just very quickly, short statements from people. If you think in your own work, what would you need to change in order to make this happen? And then go through. Bruce.
I would say more bureaucracy in terms of how to do it, and more changes in our heads. So, as an example, I take Pramod. He's got it. We need people like that, and he doesn't need to write it down. He doesn't need all the bureaucracy around.
Can you explain what you mean? He's got it.
He's a transformed individual.
I hope that is being noted.
We're still working on the gender.
He's outcome-oriented, he understands stakeholder need, that sort of thing. And I don't think it's the bureaucracy and the sort of the detailing impact pathways, huge, complicated monitoring and evaluation systems. I think it's people who get it and do it.
And who are open to the possibilities and the different kinds of stakeholders, partners. So, Philip, you wanted to come.
I was just going to say, incentives. We need to change incentives. I mean, at the organizational level, just so that people like Campbell can be appropriately rewarded and lauded.
I really like this debate. Can I come back? Can we extend it for 15 more minutes?
So more into the methodological side, I think that we need to get more expertise on analysis and models that include all sectors, not only agriculture, but see how transformations in agriculture can affect and interact with energy, with industry, with services in general. Excellent. Thank you.
I'll just add one thing. We need to sometimes focus on demand-driven research rather than just intellectual curiosity.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Robert?
We need to also learn how to communicate better our results to reach especially the policy makers, decision makers, because this is where we have to really focus to get some outcome.
Our time is almost up, so very quickly, Leo and then Jim.
Yeah, when I hear the word transformational, I'm always reminded of the book Tipping Point. I think we need to look at this thing, the strategy of how to apply the tipping point, because very often we may do so many things, but unless we are able to reach the tipping point, it won't work.
And Jim.
I'd say recognizing that at the level of rural communities, they have transformational aspirations, or if not the farmers' children do. And so understanding that, tapping into it, and understanding how our research can remove barriers so that we're enabling rather than pushing transformation.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone and conclude the seminar.